Hello and welcome. What did the partition of the Indian subcontinent really achieve? Well, 63 years after their independence from British rule, India and Pakistan are still locked in a vicious cycle of war, poverty and extremism. Thousands of troops amassed on both sides of the border, ready to launch into another conflict. The two countries have fought repeatedly over the disputed region of Kashmir, where India's leadership is accused of suppressing a separatist movement, although it counters that Pakistan is fomenting the Kashmiri insurgency by training and arming fighters. Both nations also conducted nuclear tests in 1998 and routinely spend billions of dollars buying the latest weaponry, even though they are among the poorest nations in the world, with tens of millions of people battling disease and destitution. So today we ask, what impact has South Asia and the world felt from the partition of India to create Pakistan? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we welcome your phone calls onto the show as well. I'm joined now from Lahore by Najm Sethi, editor-in-chief of the Pakistani political magazine Friday Times. He's had several run-ins with the Pakistani government over the years and was even jailed without trial in 1999. And in New Delhi, Professor Ashish Nandi, who was listed in 2008 as one of the top 100 public intellectuals of the world by US magazine Foreign Policy. He is also a prolific author, and his latest book is The Intimate Enemy: Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Najm Sethi, if I could start with you. Of course, it's a particularly tough time for Pakistan right now as it marks the anniversary of independence in the middle of a disaster that's the flooding that's been described as one of the country's most disastrous, worst natural disasters. But there's been a lot of criticism about the lack of government intervention and help for the people. To what degree is this sadly business as usual in Pakistan?
It isn't business as usual these days, but the complaint is that it has been business as usual for many years, and if it hadn't been business as usual, then things might have been better, might have been different. So there is a lot of criticism of government, but at the same time there is no backlash as yet. Maybe a month from now, when the rehabilitation process starts, that's when the complaints will really come.
But I wonder, Najm, with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Yusuf Raza Gilani, calling this the biggest challenge since the partition, can you think of any leadership in Pakistan since that partition took place that would have dealt with this differently, that would have been showing more of a sort of leadership when it comes to actually dealing with such a crisis? Unfortunately,
that's the sad and tragic part of this whole, the 63 years of Pakistan. We've never had leadership with any vision. We've never had leadership that is accountable, and we've never had leadership that has maintained the trust of the people and has very rarely delivered.
Professor Nandi, ironically, it's at times of disaster that India and Pakistan often can show some sense of unity, that heritage of common blood. And I wonder, there still seem to be some political obstacles. India was very hesitant before offering around the $5 million it has for aid for Pakistan, which is about the same amount it gave to Haiti. I wonder, is there still that much bad blood between the two countries, even at such times of crisis?
Yes, I think there is this bad blood, but I also feel that despite what it looks like, there is at the ground level much sympathy for each other. I think the people do not feel as alienated from each other as their leadership and regimes do.
Is it, Professor, a case of politicians using the tensions between the two countries to their advantage? Is it that the people have a better sense of common blood and that the politicians really don't want that kind of unity?
No, it's not that the politicians do not want it, but the politicians are caught in their own world. They have to think of their own survival, and I think in some cases not only the politicians but certain kinds of vested interests. In Pakistan, for instance, the army has a vested interest in not ensuring that the two countries perhaps do not remain as much in touch with each other as they would like to be at the ground level.
Okay, well, we've got a caller on the line from Virginia.
But Oliver, the politicians are hardly any better.
Okay, well, Oliver's on the line from Virginia. Let's get in his call. Oliver, thanks for being with us again. What's your question?
Thanks, Riz. My question basically is: does the Pakistani people feel now that the partition of India and the establishment of the state of Pakistan was a big mistake, because we see now that India is becoming, it's on their way to become a superpower, while Pakistan is having a lot of problems both internally and externally. And even like I meet people here in the States that are from Pakistan, but because of the bad reputation of Pakistan, they say that we are from India. So I think if Pakistan was part of India, it's good for the Pakistani people. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Actually, Najim Sethi, this is an interesting thing. Is there any sense of regret among any levels of Pakistani society that the partition occurred, that it's left them in a sort of economically deprived condition compared with India?
No, not at all. It's just not there. This forget about a debate. This is not even mentioned. The standard argument is that the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, gave us a true paradise, a true land for the pure, and we've made a mess of it. But the fact that perhaps if there had been no partition, we might have been better off, that issue, or worse off, that issue really hasn't come up in this country in 63 years. There is absolutely no question of it. In fact, when some friendly Indians who are interested in the cause of South Asian peace raise it and talk about it, not in the sense of whether there ought to have been a partition or not, but the fact that there is a common 600-year history and a culture and all the rest of it of South Asia, and that we are South Asians, all of us, first before anything else. The suspicion in Pakistan is that maybe this is not being sincere, they really want to gobble us back again. And although many Indians don't think that at all, and I know that as a fact, the very fact that such sentiments are expressed is a cause for suspicion in Pakistan.
Omer is on the line from Canada with us. Omer, thanks for being on the line. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, I would like to ask that, creation of Pakistan was a fantastic idea. It gave a lot of political freedom to the Muslims of this area, and basically we fought for a political freedom. And unfortunately, the media has played a very negative role, and from the very beginning, they have always been, coming in support of any usurper who has been coming. They are not really educated, and they mostly, they see initially they support, they have been on the payroll of all the leaders who have come.
Okay.
And
well, Omer, let me put this to Professor Nandi then. Sir, there's this view that, again, as I was discussing with Najim Sethi, that perhaps that the partition might have been better for Pakistanis, or if they hadn't been Pakistanis, if you like, they would have been economically better off. Let me ask you about the Muslims in India. There's such a large number, close to the number of that there is in Pakistan. How is their economic situation?
Their economic situation is not very well, but there is a reason for that, that the elite of the Muslim community did migrate to Pakistan. Frankly, I do not think that Indians anymore, or for that matter Pakistanis, rue the division of India. They have paid a heavy price for the division, but nonetheless 3 generations have lived as independent nations, and I think both these countries are now more or less reconciled. Why more or less? Well, they are fully reconciled, I would say, to being separate nations. We have to think of a different basis for their relationship, and that basis has to be worked out now.
Okay, we have let's have a look at the timeline of the India-Pakistan conflict after the partition. Now, first, the countries fought after Pakistani forces invaded Kashmir, forcing its king to ask India for help. New Delhi agreed on the condition that Kashmir would accede to India. In 1965, a UN-mandated ceasefire ended a second war over the disputed Kashmir region. Just 6 years later, India defeated Pakistan, and independent Bangladesh was created from East Pakistan. In 1999, Indian troops repelled Pakistani fighters encountered in the Indian Kashmiri mountains. So the conflict still has remained on and off. But Najim Sethi, what went wrong as far as Pakistan's sort of leadership, if you like, considering both countries have the same starting point in effect? Why has India been able to build such a rapidly growing middle class, while Pakistan often seems to linger between this master or servant kind of class division?
I think I can answer the Pakistan part of it better. Perhaps Ashish can talk about why India was able to develop a middle class and successfully establish a democratic system that works up to a point. I think there were several reasons why we in Pakistan couldn't really get our act going. The first was that our main political party, the Muslim League, was a party of landed aristocrats. Unlike the Indian Congress, which was a party which cut across class lines and regional lines. Ours was largely a Punjab-based party, landlords, number one. Number two, it really hadn't had much time to rule in the earlier 2 decades, even in those provinces where there was a Muslim majority. Number three, I think the army and the bureaucracy that we inherited from the colonial setup were relatively overdeveloped and more confident about themselves, whereas the political class wasn't, which is why from 1947 to 1958 we had no elections. A string of prime ministers from amongst the bureaucracy came and went, and then we didn't even get a constitution until 1973. So I think some of these factors, a relatively overdeveloped bureaucracy and army, especially a bureaucracy that had migrated from India and an army that was led by the British initially, gave them a very strong sense of defining what the new nationhood would be. Okay. And the weak political class with very little experience of governance or indeed of sharing power, of trying to bring other classes in. But at the end of the day, I think the tone between India and Pakistan was set in 1948, when, as per the rules of the game, Kashmir should have come to Pakistan, but it didn't. And thereby hangs a whole tale of how the Pakistani military bureaucratic establishment, along with the landlords, then went on to construct a national security state instead of a social security state. And the basis of that state was a so-called ideology of Pakistan, at the basis of which was the fact that India is inimical to Pakistan, India wants to destroy us or gobble us back, and we have to sacrifice everything for national security.
Well, let's get Adil on the line from Pakistan and hear your question, please, Adil.
Hello, Riz, how are you? Assalamu alaikum.
Good. Walaikum assalam, thanks.
I just want to add on the previous question, which was told that is there any regret about the independence of Pakistan? What I feel that they are mistaken, and we are proud of this decision. And in case anybody has a regret, he must look at the situation of the Muslims, how they are suffering in India. Okay. And if someone thinks that India is going to be superpower, it's something like daydreaming. The number of hungry people they have, I think that equals the hungry people in the whole world.
Okay, Adil, well, what we'll do is Adil, we'll get Professor Ashish Nandi's perspective on that when we return. We're going to take a very short break. When we return, we'll also look at the role of the British in the partition of India and how they could have avoided the ensuing bloodbath. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Conflict, corruption, poverty and extremism. That's largely been the story of India and Pakistan since the independence of the countries 63 years ago. What role did India's colonial ruler Britain play in the partition of the subcontinent, and to what extent was it responsible for the violence that followed? Joining me to discuss these issues are Najm Sethi, one of Pakistan's best-known journalists. He's received death threats from the Taliban for his outspoken opposition to the rise of Islamic extremism in Pakistan. And Professor Ashish Nandi, considered to be one of India's foremost thinkers. Professor Nandi witnessed the horrors of the partition as a child, and he's written extensively about them. Now, as we get back to questions, Professor Nandi, I'll get back to you and the comment we had just before the break from Adil. The issue of Muslims in India, just to revisit that, you talked a little bit about this. For India to progress any further, I guess this is something it has to consider as a priority, and also perhaps to stop sort of civil unrest. The figures I have is that something like 37.2% of the country, 410 million odd people, live below the poverty line. A large number of that population is Muslim as well. What does India need to do to address these kind of issues in order to move forward onto the global stage in a bigger way?
Frankly, I do not think economic development and attainment of a status as a superpower depends on the proportion of people living below poverty line. That's a pity, because I do not look forward to India becoming a global superpower. I look forward to India becoming a more human, compassionate society. And I think if you look at it that way, India's achievements have been less than grand in the matter of economic growth and development. I think India could have established a more, let me put it this, more normal relationship with Pakistan over the last 60 years, which it has failed to do. And India's relationship with its other neighbors are not very good either. Okay. I think that's a pity, and it's a major failure of the Indian nation state.
Well, in looking at the situation, Najm Sethi, if I could put to you an email that we had from a viewer, Fatima Ahmed wrote in saying, Partition was the result of the colonizers' divide and rule policy. Pakistanis, Indians and Bangladeshis are the same people. Could we not get over what the British did to us and live in peace? To what extent do you view, what do you think of that view basically? How do you view the British legacy in all of this?
It's true that the British used the policy of divide and rule, but that lasted as long as they were ruling. And of course it left its legacy of hatred and communalism and all the rest of it. There's no doubt about that. But I think at the end of the day, neither the British nor the man who created Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they did not want to divide India. Indeed, as late as 1946, only a year before partition became inevitable, the British floated the Cabinet Mission Plan. And in the Cabinet Mission Plan, which the Congress and the Muslim League both accepted, the notion of a unitary India, but with a large degree of autonomy for all the states of self-governance was floated. And I think that fell through only because of the distrust factor between Congress and between the Muslim League, because at the last minute Congress turned around, especially Mr. Nehru, turned around and said we want the Muslim representative to be nominated by Congress, at least one or two of them. And Mr. Jinnah said no, and I think that sealed the fate, which is why when Lord Mountbatten arrived a year later, he knew that the die was cast, and therefore he moved swiftly. I think at the end of the day, the British cut their losses and ran.
Oh, well, Dubai on the line now. Reg would have a question or comment to add. Go ahead, Reg.
I just want to ask the panel there as to whether, you know, with the reflection of over the comments I've just heard from the previous caller, of whether Pakistan has become a bit of a victim of its own circumstances by the mindset that has been created within people of, you know, violence, of intolerance, of being very talking from a very sort of high point to and looking down on other religions and the neighbors that surround them. Is it that we see, on the other hand, India making all this progress, at least economically, and the other country, Pakistan, that lives side by side, being sort of becoming a victim of its own circumstances.
Reg, let me put it this way to Najm Sethi. To what degree has the Pakistani mindset, with the rule the way it has been over the past 6 decades or so, how has the Pakistani mindset changed with regards to itself and you know, the way Pakistanis see themselves?
I think the Pakistani mindset has changed in the last 30 years. When I was growing up, in the first 30 years, you know, we were a very moderate, tolerant society. And then came the Afghan jihad, and the Pakistani military and the Americans got together to launch the notion of an Islamic jihad against the Soviet Union. And I think that has cost us in Pakistan dearly, because although the Americans went back, we were then left with the whole question and notion of jihad and jihadis who had to be put to work. And I think that's when the real tensions were ratcheted up with India all over again, after the jihad, when the whole issue of Kashmir became alive once again. Before 1965, before the war with India in 1965, people used to come and go. There wasn't any big deal about travel between the two countries. And it's only after 1965 that trade was restricted and various other things happened. And then again there was a relaxation, and then of course everything changed in the 1980s. So there has been a change in the Pakistani mindset. Revisionist histories have been written in the last 20 years, painting India as the enemy par excellence, and painting jihad and radical Islam and the Islamic way of life as the one that provides for salvation. There's no doubt about that. And that is part of the recent legacy that we need to undo in this country if we are to move forward.
Professor Nandi, a question that came by email, if I can put this to you. It came from Poland. And Leon Ahoma wrote in saying, poverty and unemployment are the causes of Nigeria's Christian-Muslim clashes. That would have been the fate of unpartitioned India if Islamic Pakistan wasn't created. Do you think it really could have been the case? Do you think that the country could have fallen apart from within if there hadn't been the partition? Of course, the partition took so many lives in itself.
I do not think so. But on the other hand, I think to think about undoing the partition after 60 years is absolutely not only insane, but positively destructive. I think the main problem of Pakistan at the moment is this, that it has not found a positive self-definition. Pakistan's self-definition remains that it is not India. It is that negative self-definition which has dogged Pakistan's steps throughout the last 60 years, and I think that the Pakistani intellectuals and the middle classes have failed the state.
Now, Professor, do you have any kind of optimism that relations between the countries will improve, or are we going to see another 6 decades of this kind of tension?
No, I do not think so. I think in both countries now there is a subterranean sentiment that somehow or other this problem should be handled, this problem should be kept in check. And I must say, to the credit of Pakistan, that at least one political party once fought an election on the platform of bringing about peace with India, and it won the elections. And I think that speaks volumes for the public sentiment in favor of some kind of an understanding with India. I think everything said in India too, there is the feeling that somehow India must have some kind of an understanding with Pakistan and not allow this problem to fester and handicap Indian state itself.
Okay, Professor Ashish Nandi and Najm Sethi, really good to have you both on. Thank you very much for your contributions to this debate. And thank you for being with us, of course. Remember, you can download a podcast of the show on iTunes. This week, watch our discussion with Indian Member of Parliament Shashi Tharoor on India's growth as a global political force. On the next show, could fires raging outside Moscow mean the end for Russia's longtime political leader? In addition to the deadly smog from the blaze, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin's also facing an economic downturn that have many questioning the country's power structure. Do send in your thoughts for that and tune in when we have that show. Till then, from me and the team, goodbye. We'll see you next time.